stretch now. Hopefully everybody's having a great time. Our third and final session for this symposium, and I think it promises to be as extraordinary as the first two. I'd like to welcome, we have two esteemed academics with us into this conversation. We have with the flouting the USC colors here, we have Dr. Matt Kahn. He serves as the Provost Professor of Economics and Spatial Sciences at the University of Southern California, if you can tell that from his background. And then we have our own Dr. Franklin Chien, who is an assistant professor of finance here and one of our real estate instructors at UNC Kenan-Flagler Business School. Now, both Matt and Franklin conduct research that kind of goes between the intersection of urban and labor economics, real estate finance and housing dynamics. And today, they're going to lead us through a discussion of how the war for tech companies and the talent that follows them will shape communities across the country, which we'll find out has significant implications for a number of areas of our lives, including the housing market. So with that, Matt, Franklin, the floor is yours, and thanks for being here with us today.
Jim, I want to thank you, and I'm really eager to learn and to talk to my friend Franklin. Franklin, you're looking good. Hey,
thank you, Matt.
Oh, you kept moving on my Zoom screen. Franklin, I know you have a great presentation to show us, so I'm going to mute myself and give you the floor for you to talk about your great research.
It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for inviting me and Matt to talk about winners and losers when high tech companies come into your town. So this is kind of roughly based on some research I've done, and we're hoping to keep it conversational. So as I go, Matt, you should feel free to interrupt me, and if you have any questions, please send them to the chat. So we like to keep it as engaging as possible, even if it's a virtual seminar, virtual edition. So recently that there are a lot of local government leaders who are competing for large high-skill firm entries, right? And with huge amount of tax subsidies. A recent example is, as you all know, over 200 cities across the US have competed for the second headquarter of Amazon, with many of which offered large tax incentives. So, on the one hand, supporters are very excited about these large high-skill firm entries. On the positive side, people are excited about the potential job and wage growth, how they can stimulate the local economy. On the negative side, opponents fear about neighborhood gentrification, rising inequality, as well as the heavy price tag of some of these state and local tax subsidies. Because as we know, if we kind of lower the corporate tax for some of these firms to lure them to come to your city, we might actually not be able to raise enough tax revenue to cover those costs. And as a result, we might have to eventually actually raise tax down the road, and local provision of public goods might suffer. Our investment in school qualities and local infrastructure might actually suffer negatively in the longer run. But there's actually hasn't been much of a research evidence on who are the winners and losers when especially among the local incumbent residents, the people who already live in the nearby affected areas, when these high-tech, high-skill firms come to your city, who are the winners and losers, and how much they win and lose? Intuitively, that's kind of, we think these kind of distribution of welfare benefits is going to depend on people's prior skill and employment status, and perhaps their home ownership status. So I've done some research which I would like to share with you today. So I'm an applied microeconomist, so I like to use data. I like to come up with evidence using big data sets. And so in this particular research I like to share with you today, what I did is I've actually followed about 45 million incumbent residents. These are people who are already living in the area when these high-skill, high-tech firms come into their city. I follow their individual level migration history. So I got a quite interesting data set that actually follows each of their individual address as they move around. And I link these address histories to their housing characteristics, so I can figure out who are the homeowners and renters, and also link these to their credit reports so I can study their individual outcomes, such as their financial health. And so what I did is I followed about 391 such high-skill firm entries that happened in the US across 2 decades, from 1990 to 2010. And each of these firm entries promised to hire more than 500 new employees. And I used some econometric methods to try to really carefully study the effects of these firm entries on the set of incumbent residents living in nearby affected neighborhoods and communities. And I try to use an economic model to evaluate the welfare consequences for the incumbent residents based on their prior skill level, as well as home ownership status as well. Just to show you a picture of where these 391 high-skill firm entries happened, as you can see, they are kind of scattered around the whole country, many of which are clustered around major metropolitan cities, major metropolitan areas in the US. Here, the size of each is actually proportional to the initially announced employment. Just some examples of these high-skill firm entries, Amazon, this is their first headquarter in Seattle in 2007, General Motors, AMD, Micron, Cisco, BMW. And just before I kind of share with you a summary of my findings, I just want to kind of briefly talk about some of the factors that matter for firms' location decisions. What are the factors that firms think about when they pick a location to enter? I think some of the key factors are, pretty intuitive. They want to look for places where there is a high level of human capital. So, places like here, the Research Triangle area offers great universities. Therefore, we have a great labor pool, which can kind of readily supply the kind of skilled labor that tech firms like Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft can, which they would desire to hire. And we also offer great medical services through a number of the world-class medical facilities in the area. They prefer to enter places with great traffic, transportation infrastructures, and very importantly, they care about the local supply chain conditions. We've had kind of a history of here. We have a history of biotech, a successful history of attracting biotech research companies and biotech manufacturing companies. So therefore, the local supply chain kind of plays to our strengths. As some of you know, we kind of recently lost a deal to Alabama for the Hyundai Mazda plant. And part of the key reason is that Alabama as a state just had a much longer history of, working with car manufacturers. And in fact, to host Hyundai, their biggest factory in the US. So they kind of have a more supply chain that is ready to go when Toyota Mazda moves. And then lastly, there's this key factor I want to emphasize. There has been a lot of competition among state and local municipalities in offering tax subsidies to attract these firms. And so much so that we worry about this could be a race to the bottom phenomenon. As sort of a piece of evidence here, I'm trying to show you that over time, the size of these tax incentives have grown dramatically. And this is plotted as the size of the incentives as a share, as a percentage of the local corporate tax revenues. And as we can see, going from the early 90s to the 2015, the share of these firm incentives as a percentage of the local corporate tax revenue have grown over 30% now. So these tax subsidies are getting increasingly expensive. So I want to give you kind of a summary of what I find. Who are the winners and losers among the incumbent residents? So what I find is, first of all, for the typical high-skill firm entry across my sample, I find the low-skill renters, they are harmed. On the other hand, the low-skill homeowners, who actually makes up a substantial share of the local low-skill population, they're actually not harmed, and some of them might even benefit in some cases. And then the high-skill incumbents are really the beneficiaries here, and quite intuitively, because their wage are going to grow after these high-skill firm entries. they're in high demand. And among them, especially the high skill homeowners, they win even, they have substantial gains. And I want to give you a sense of the magnitude of the impact on the different skill and homeownership groups. So here I'm trying to look at the average impact on incumbents living in nearby affected areas. And my research suggests that, and this is linked to the gentrification debate as well. So I find that both the low skill renters and the low skill homeowners, they're both more likely to move away from their original neighborhood, and they're more likely to move out of the city when compared to people of the same demographic group kind of living further away, therefore less exposed to the large high skill firm entries. And when these low skill renters move, on average, they also move to neighborhoods of slightly lower neighborhood qualities, as proxied by lower home values, medium household income, as well as upward mobility of children. And then if we try to convert some of these effects into dollar units, as we like to do for economists, I find that for the average incumbent resident in a city where these high skill firm entry happened, the effect is quite small for the average incumbent. For example, after 5 years, the low skill renters, they would incur an annual welfare loss that is only equivalent to about a 0.2% decrease of their initial wages prior to these firm entries happening. And if you translate that into a dollar amount, that's an annual welfare loss that's equivalent to about $55 only. And this is quite small compared to, say, the earning loss due to a typical job displacement. If you lose your job in the longer run, you tend to experience a permanent wage decline of about 15%, so much larger than the effects them finding here. But I want to emphasize that this is for the average incumbent in the city, because keep in mind that most incumbent residents in the city are not directly impacted by these high skill firm entries, right? Most incumbent residents are only indirectly impacted through sort of general equilibrium effects of wage and house prices changes. So there's likely going to be a group of low skill incumbent residents, who are actually harmed much more compared to the averages. But when you aggregate these effects across everyone who initially live in the city, I think the numbers are still quite substantial. For example, if we look at the aggregate impact across all incumbent residents in the city, who are living within 50 miles from where the firm entered, I find an annual welfare change of a positive $25.2 million of a high skill firm entering into a metropolitan area of the size of 1.1 million population after 5 years. Again, these are annual permanent welfare changes. And then to just benchmark against that number, the average amount of firm-specific subsidies that local governments provide to attract a firm of, say, who offers 1,000 new jobs is around $107 million. So what this suggests is that for the typical high skill firm entry in my sample, the benefits accrued to the local population will exceed the cost of the firm subsidies, after 5 years also in the longer run. However, this does carry kind of consequences on inequality, right? Because again, remember, there are some winners and losers of these high skill firm entries. And to kind of highlight the impact on inequality, you can think of it in a number of ways. I find that the low skill renters who initially live within 10 minutes from the firm's entry location, they actually bear the brunt of the cost. Compared to, so for those low skill renters living within 10 minutes, they lose an annual equivalent of $450 per capita relative to high skill homeowners, who is the biggest winner, who are also living within 10 minutes from the firm entry. So that difference, right, is kind of a size of a stimulus check on an annual basis, which I think is quite substantial impact on inequality. And then if we look at low skill homeowners, interestingly, they actually gain the equivalent of an annual $200 per capita relative to the high-skilled renters who are initially living close to the firm entry. This is suggesting that for these high-skilled renters, for the average firm entry, the kind of increase in wage benefits is not enough to offset the increase in rising rents, right? So they ended up actually losing out to the low-skilled homeowners. For the low-skilled homeowners, their wage might not increase as much as the high-skilled workers. However, since they're homeowners, they're kind of insured against the risk of these rising rents, right? And then I also find that the welfare loss is actually bigger for low-skilled renters who ended up leaving, who ended up moving away from their original neighborhood. So, just to kind of conclude on my results. So, I think the results I provided is for the typical average firm entry across 400 also such high skill firm entries in my sample. And keep in mind that these effects are for a single isolated high skill firm entry, right? So these effects could be quite larger or much more extreme in the kind of more extreme cases of firm entries, such as Amazon's second headquarter. And then, in an area like the Raleigh-Durham Triangle area, we could have multiple high-skill firm entries happening in a short period of time. And therefore, the impact could be much bigger as well, right? As we pretty much feel it, like, here in downtown Durham, it's fast gentrifying area because of all these high-tech, high-skill firm entries. What are the solutions? Like, my results speak to that, there is a group of people who are definitely harmed, and those are the low-skill renters, right? So how to help people who are, especially those who initially live close to the firm entry, how do we help them? I think innovative solutions along the lines of what we just discussed in the last session, how to provide affordable housing opportunities, both for renters and homeowners, is very much needed in an area like this. Another solution could be, we could provide some sort of rental insurance, on the government side, just as how we found other types of social insurances to insure the renters from the risk of rising rents. And then lastly, I just kind of, want to, in anticipation to the following discussion, kind of open up to this question that what's going to happen after COVID and the rise of work from home, how is it going to kind of impact the future flow of high-skill jobs? How is it going to impact the future location choices of these high-skill firms? And how is it going to impact the people living nearby? And thank you very much for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions. And
so, Franklin, I'm going to give you some questions and some remarks. Can you stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
So I think that this is fantastic work, and I want to play my role as old guy. And a benefit of getting old is you've been in the field a long time. So Timothy Bartik, 30 years ago, wrote a book on local economic development. And he found in his work, when you attract a major factory, and that's different than an Amazon HQ2, but when you attract a major factory, he rejected the hypothesis using some simple econometrics that unemployed local people got the jobs. He also rejected the hypothesis that people out of the labor force took these jobs. He concluded that migrants to the area got these jobs. And so it raises a very interesting issue. And I think that Franklin's results are in accord with Bartik's old results, that when you attract new jobs, who wins? That's absolutely fascinating. Something that I want folks thinking about in relation to Franklin's work is winner's curse. There really is no average effect here. If Amazon HQ2 had gone to Baltimore, what would have its impact have been? If Amazon HQ2 went to North Korea, what would have its impact have been? So what interests me very much is that the politicians offering these local incentives are sort of guessing. They've never run this experiment before. And so in the language of economics, these are heterogeneous treatment effects. If a location has attracted a General Motors factory in the past, do they learn anything of what they would gain if they attract an Amazon? You can hire economists as consultants to do these multiplier analyses, but I think it's very interesting when you offer large tax incentives when you don't really know what the consequences will be. And so winner's curse is this idea that the most optimistic are most likely to win the bid, but that the winner's might regret their bid because they overpay. And so something I'm going to ask Franklin about later, I want to make several points, is there a good test in this literature of winner's curse? As we think ahead to Amazon HQ3, when could a place, if you anticipate winner's curse, what's your best strategy? And is winner's curse just an economic idea, or does it have relevance for municipal finance? Another point that I want to ask Franklin about relates to the local multiplier effect. Enrico Moretti wrote a famous paper arguing that for every high-skilled job a city attracts, that creates 5 service sector jobs. It looked to me like Franklin it looks to me, and I think I'm going to let him in a second, it looks to me like Franklin's work is not as optimistic, at least in the cases he studies, of a large local multiplier effect for less skilled folks. So Franklin, let me stop my rap there. Can you speak at all to what we learned from your work about the local multiplier effect? Does this create middle-class jobs, enough of them, in these non-traded sector that can't be outsourced to Asia or somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually have a bit of evidence in my paper on local multiplier effects as well. I do find that, first of all, I do validate that, most of these firm entries, they do deliver the amount of jobs that they promised. So, after 5 to 10 years, a lot of the jobs that they promised actually do happen. And this is validated using data from the zip code business patterns, where I can actually count and track the number of jobs at different firm establishments by different industry codes. So in the industry codes that these firms entered, I see some jobs being directly generated. So that's
but let me stop you there. But that's not Moretti's question. Moretti's question is, if a guy gets hired who makes $250,000 a year, does he drink microbrews? Does he get his hair cut locally? How does this stimulate the service sector?
Yeah, that's great. So and then I also look at, like, kind of in similar industries, right? In firms that have similar or have a small economic distance to the firm that entered, are we generating more high skill jobs? So I actually look at that as well, and the answer is yes. So I do see that these high skill firm entries actually led to a higher amount of high skill jobs being generated in related industries as well. And then I also went to look at, does this generate more jobs in the non-tradable service sectors? When these high skilled workers come into Raleigh, Durham, Triangle area, are they generating more jobs in downtown Raleigh or downtown Durham? More restaurants and bars. The evidence is quite mixed there. Like, I don't see much of a good evidence of an increase on average. Perhaps because the nature of the firm entries in my sample, most of them are high-skill, high-tech manufacturing firms.
So you're saying these guys don't drink beer and don't get haircuts? These are strange nerds?
No. So a caveat of that analysis is I'm comparing neighborhoods that are more exposed versus less exposed, kind of in terms of driving distance to the firm's entry location. And I don't find statistically significant effects on the number of restaurants and gyms and bars per capita.
Let me push you on that. You're making an implicit assumption. So in Moretti's setup, if Matthew works at USC, but he lives near UCLA, which I do, then the job creation would be where I live, not where I work. So do you have data on where these guys live as well as where they work?
Yeah, so I am looking at people who are living in places that are more exposed versus those that are less exposed. And of course, like in the language of econometrics, I'm controlling for their proximity to nearby desirable locations for high skill firms to enter. I don't find an effect on the number per capita, but I don't have great data on the quality. So perhaps you just have better restaurants opening up, not in terms of quantity, but in terms of the quality. And the other thing that you're alluding to is very relevant for an area like this, where the new jobs are actually concentrated in the Research Triangle Park, what we call the RTP, but the amenity center, the center for consuming non-tradable services, where you go drink and go to eat, there's actually in Raleigh and Durham downtown, and these are quite separated. So when I look at people who are living close to versus further away from the firm's entry location, I don't necessarily get the agglomeration or spillover effects in the non-service sector.
Thank you. So let me go back to my outline, because this speaks directly to something I wanted to talk about. Folks, many of America's productive cities don't have road pricing. If we had road pricing like Singapore, and if we could move at 40 miles per hour, that would change analyses like Franklin's, that your geography, if you could move at infinite speed, then where you are doesn't matter. You just snap your fingers and I could be in London now. And so a key issue is speed in cities. Housing would be more affordable. There'd be more neighborhoods to live in when Amazon comes to town if you could move at higher speeds in these cities. And in my new work, I've argued that work from home, effectively that some people will be going to work just 2 or 3 days a week, that this will slightly declog the roads and give us more flexibility over when we commute and travel. Franklin, a question. I know you know the real estate literature. A key issue on whether attracting an Amazon leads to soaring home prices is the shape of housing supply. As we've learned from Glazer and Jorko, in those cities, and they're often progressive cities, I've documented this in my own work, in those cities like San Francisco, Boston, Portland, Santa Monica, New York, that don't build housing, increases in demand lead to higher home prices. Have you seen any of the cities that have attracted major firms that they simultaneously deregulated the real estate sector, allowing these guys to upzone and to build more housing, to have the win-win of job growth and affordable housing? Or did they confront the new people moving to these cities with an inelastic supply curve?
Yeah, that's a quick question. I haven't specifically looked at which cities relaxed their zoning and land use in response to the high scale firm entries. I did find some heterogeneous effects based on how stringent land use regulations were prior to the firm entry. I do see in places where land supply is more constrained, where land use regulation is more stringent, the effect on the increase in house prices afterwards closer to the firm entry is bigger. But that's definitely true. But that really calls for a more innovative approach on part of the local governments to see we should really be expanding housing supply, or trying to provide better traffic infrastructure so people can more readily commute from longer distances.
Now, I like
some of the impacts.
You made several very important points about inequality. One way to address inequality, if I'm a renter, is to sign a long-term contract. It's interested many real estate experts. Why don't we have multi-year rental contracts? And as a believer in capitalism, this would be one way to lock in your rent to protect yourself. So to own a 10-year bond versus a 1-year bond. Why do you have any theories there of why we haven't seen multi-year rental contracts? And would that give some peace of mind to renters that they can lock in a rate?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's just not in the landlord's incentive to provide multi-year contracts, especially in a fast-growing area like here, where house prices are increasing rapidly. So landlords like to have the flexibility of changing their tenants and raising rents, and get the benefits of rising home values. I think that's why, but maybe you have a different perspective.
Oh, but there's a risk sharing. It may be that the renters anticipate that they can get rent control laws and other set asides. So I'm a believer in letting markets work. And so if there is a demand for housing affordability, there's a question of who bears the risk of appreciation. And there might be ways to fix that. So let me go back to my outline of comments here. So our goal here is to think about, with the next batch of headquarters that might open. You correctly pointed out that Research Triangle continues to boom. Franklin, I'm interested in other areas. I lived for 2 years in Baltimore. Baltimore has Amazon warehouses. It doesn't have Amazon HQ2s. Something that interests me is the following. Baltimore has a problem that it has too much affordable housing. So, folks, as I think about our topic, there's an element of Goldilocks. I live at a place near Beverly Hills where there's no affordable housing. There's plenty of affordable housing in Cleveland, Detroit, Baltimore. And so an interesting question is we actually want more gentrification in some cities that have not successfully competed for headquarters. And in my book, I'm going to wave my book at you, Unlocking the Potential. Oh, don't even see it on the screen. In my book, Unlocking the Potential of Post-Industrial Cities, I explore why Baltimore was not more successful in attracting major firms to locate there. So, Franklin, a question. In your work on site selection of these firms, do you do a revealed preference analysis, for example, of center city crime? So you kept coming back to your mentor, Rebecca Diamond's ideas that high-skilled cities attract these firms. But Franklin, that's a slightly politically incorrect line, because the flip of that means that high-poverty places don't attract these places. Without putting you on the spot, what can high-poverty cities do to be more likely to be in play for the next set of these companies? Or is the answer they're not going to attract these companies, and thus they need to focus on small business entrepreneurship? Have you thought about that, of what lessons your work has for the cities that haven't competed well for these headquarters?
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. I mean, I think here, this area is actually a good example of providing some of the lessons. So actually, when I actually went to Duke University for my undergrad about 10 years ago now, and back in those days, downtown Durham is pretty much a ghost town with high crime rates and high poverty rates. And all the jobs are very far away from here. And basically the only employee in town is Duke University. So a lot of the people work in the service, work at service jobs for Duke. And I think, in an area like this, I think we're putting a lot of effort in investing in our schools and our universities to make sure we have a labor force that is ready when these high skill firms come in. And then we have first class medical services as well. And then over time, what I observed is the private investors, like, Duke is actually the landowner for a lot of the land here. And they worked with the local municipalities. They heavily invested in the downtown areas. First they converted some old industrial compound into retail spaces, and they built a performance arts center, which is a huge, phenomenal success. And over time, like, people started to trickle in to the downtown area, and the government made a lot of effort in, trying to attract high skill firm entries into the broader area. And then because young folks, high skill folks, they disproportionately value, consumption amenities, and many people started to come and live in Durham. So perhaps that is a useful path.
So where I agree with you, and one of the themes of my book is that Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit, that the high crime in these cities acts on as a tax on the consumer city, that people don't want to go out at night. And Franklin, I know you know this. When I've talked to leading tech executives, they have said to me that in where they choose to locate their headquarters, whether there are many immigrants working at these companies, and that it's crucial that they and their families feel safe and feel that public services are good. So at a time, you had several slides on inequality. You keep coming back to Raleigh, to Durham. This is a rich, high human capital area. I'm interested in a broader question of, will tech increase prosperity across America? And I wanted to tell you about a theme of my new book, Going Remote, which will be published next year. Baltimore is 40 miles from Washington, D.C. Amazon HQ3 is in the Virginia, D.C. area. I talk in my book that with the rise of work from home, people can live in one area and work in another as they partially work from home. And so in the language of economics, there's going to be an unbundling. that tech firms can physically have a location near an airport and their workforce can be really spread around. And so that this is going to be a way for more successful people to live in Baltimore, if that's where their roots are, if that's where their friends, and that's where their fun is, but then to work somewhere else. And so, Franklin, if you revisit your work 3 years from now, do you think that there will be an unbundling, that more workers, when a city attracts an HQ3, will most of those workers actually live in the area or live somewhere else? And does that affect the affordability question? What interesting issues will that raise if work from home unbundles attracting a headquarters from attracting its talent?
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be a future trend in some of the industries where work remote can happen more easily, like software industries is a good example. You can literally telecommute from anywhere. There is a bit of a concern of, in the longer run, would we lose a bit of productivity because we're not able to like sit face to face and and benefit from some of the in-person agglomeration effects, as Moretti points out in his recent work. But in other high-tech, high-skill industries,
do you really think that's true? So I argue in my book that there's quality versus quantity of interaction. If I go to USC 2 days a month, I see enough of my colleagues. And so if I can sit at home and not commute, I can actually get some work done. So I'm half cracking a joke here, but I argue in my book that we've had too much quantity face-to-face time. In a world where people just go in even 4 days a month, there would be quality interactions versus quality versus quantity. What do you think?
I think if we can make that happen, that's great. And maybe the firms can move to cheaper locations in the more suburban areas, and you only need to commute 2 days a week into office, and you still get to interact with your colleagues. That's great. But maybe it might be difficult for me to kind of commute 2 days across the country.
Oh, but there, what I talk about in my book is if you're next to an airport hub, you might go for 5 days a month and just fly into a Southwest hub. But of course, you're right, because one of the themes of our session is on housing affordability. And so if we spread out, if work from home leads to some businesses to spread out, this makes the middle class lifestyle much more affordable for more people, as there's sort of a game of musical chairs. Some companies, of course, will stay in center cities. I'm highly optimistic about Raleigh's future, but Raj Chetty has done such great work on the geography of opportunity. And to some degree, the United States has had, go back to that map you put up, there has not been an equal playing field of talent across the United States. And I think that work from home is actually going to spread things out. That I predict we're going to see more superstars living in Baltimore, but not working there, as they work in Philadelphia, they work in DC, and they intermittently visit those headquarters. And so part of the housing affordability puzzle is sharing opportunity. So Franklin, in the North Carolina area, have there been distant suburbs of Raleigh that have boomed because of Durham's boom?
I would think so, even though I'm not totally familiar with Raleigh's geography, but I think that would definitely attract some of the workers to kind of be more spread out and move to places that are further away from their work locations, and because they have to commute less frequently. Myself is actually a good example of that. I work at UNC, but I live in Durham downtown because I value the amenities here. So I only go into office probably 3 days a week right now.
And so something that I want, and I think, Jim, we can open this up in a couple of minutes. My formula for achieving housing affordability and improving poor people's and middle-class people's quality of life is the rise of 3D printers for making housing, the rise of modular housing, a change in our zoning code to upzone that will help us to adapt to climate change. I'm actively doing work on identifying areas, working with climate science entities like First Street Foundation to identify areas that face less fire risk and flood risk. We're always rebuilding our cities and housing stock. If we can have this win-win of areas attracting tech companies, but then of allowing housing to be built And if we have road pricing and we have work from home, we allow many more middle-class people to have access to the productivity without the ugly laws of supply and demand pricing middle-class people out. So Franklin, let me turn that into a question. In a Goldilocks sense, do you have a vision of how areas, are you optimistic that local officials are wrestling well with achieving job growth without having sky-high rents? Or do you, or this fundamental tension, do you have a way out of this, or it involves renter insurance and the other policies you talked about?
Yeah, I think rental insurance could be a way out, and let's not put the not put the burden on the shoulder of landlords as in the case of rent control policies, but let's trying to provide some type of social insurance to share the risk. I think it just requires the local governments to work closely with some of the high-tech firms that are entering to provide more affordable housing opportunities as well in various creative ways. I think in a place like here, we're slightly underprepared, as I observe. I don't think the Durham government has a kind of a full plan for what type of affordable homes we can provide when all the high tech firm entries happened in a couple of years. So certainly, I hope we can build more affordable housing and use programs like rental insurance as solutions.
And a final question. This is the age of field experiments. Is there a randomization you would want to do if you could to really nail some of these research questions of yours? Yeah,
I mean, the question I can't quite answer well with my research design is, what difference is it going to make if Amazon chooses Virginia versus Arlington, Virginia versus Baltimore? So that is a very difficult experiment to do. If we can come up with a research design to answer that, that would be great. And something that is of personal interest to me is based on something I observed in this area. Again, like house prices have risen by more than 25% since Apple and Google and Microsoft announcement of their entries earlier this year. And they're bringing thousands of jobs and building some of their largest plants in the US. And how do kind of the local residents form expectations of house price growth and rent growth in the future in response to such news is somewhat interesting and peculiar to me. Like, why is there such an extreme response? What factors, what informations are people looking at when they form their expectations of house price and rent changes? And is there much heterogeneity in the way people form expectations about these house price changes? Perhaps if I think I'm going to be a worker who can benefit more from these firm entries, suppose I work in a firm that is closer in economic distance to Apple, Amazon, and Microsoft, I might adjust my expectation. Whereas versus if I'm a low-skill worker who I don't think I will directly benefit, or if I'm a renter, I think I'm going to be harmed, I would downplay my expectation. That's something that's really interesting to me. Perhaps that's ideal for a field experiment.
So an advantage of being an old guy is I wrote a paper on that set in China where we surveyed a bunch of renters and asked them about their subjective expectations of rental price growth in their city over the next year. And so we got a bell-shaped curve of who was the most optimistic about rental price growth, and who thought rents would be flat. We surveyed the following year the same people, and those who were most optimistic about price appreciation were the most likely to purchase an apartment in China during that time period. So I agree with you. It's very interesting to elicit people's expectations and who acts upon those expectations. Because if you expect that housing is going to become less affordable, then relative to earning that 0% interest rate that the Treasury bills are now paying, you do want a piece of housing. And it's again, there's a fascinating issue about housing supply And do localities allow new construction to be built? The United States has made itself poor. Shea and Moretti have documented that the United States would be a richer nation right now if we built more housing in our most productive cities. That the nation is poorer because we haven't done that. And that's a central issue, bringing real estate scholars and macro scholars together, that localities with their zoning and their NIMBYism have, in part, chosen to not be affordable because incumbent homeowners are powerful politically and know what they gain, as Franklin's work documents. Jim, with that, can we bring you in? I don't see anything in the chat room. We've knocked everyone out.
Yeah, we'll look for some questions. I have a couple myself, if you guys don't mind. And one, just going along those lines, I mean, as Franklin said, we've seen extraordinary price appreciation, both from the single family market and rents in the multifamily market over the last, call it 18 to maybe 24 months, in advance of most of these high wage firms setting up operations. The newer, there's clearly already a segment of them here, but some of the more notorious ones like an Apple or a Google. Is it, for either of you guys, have you done any research that shows us what's going to happen next? In other words, does that become exacerbated when those folks start moving into this market from Cupertino or wherever they are today? Or does it relax in some form or fashion because the kind of the locals, if you will, the incumbents get out ahead of the actual demand? Is there any kind of forecasting that you can share with us, or insights that might lead us to be able to forecast that?
Matt, do you want to go?
So I'm stumped, and so Franklin, what goes through my mind on Jim's excellent question is momentum of so in your work as a firm. As a city attracts a superstar firm, does that create a domino effect? So did you see that in your work of smaller firms following the bigger firm? Because that could provide a supply and demand explanation for Jim's momentum point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I do have some solid evidence on smaller, but also complementary firms to the high skill firm that enters, they're generating more jobs and they follow lead of the high skill firm entry, and that's definitely happening. So that would explain. So that suggests there's some real economic growth and beyond the direct impact of these high skill firm entries that justifies some of the rent and house growths, because again, when people form expectation by house price changes, they're taking into account of the future, right? All the future changes of jobs and wage growth. So it is not that strange to us economists that the house prices can outgrow job growth in the short run.
And Franklin, I'd add one point. So Carl Case of Case and Schiller and I would talk about that you can't short real estate. So do pessimists in a market have any way to express themselves if they're pessimistic about an overheated market? And so Jim, I'd have you think, if there was a way for the bears to express themselves, would that temper any of these, I don't want to call it a bubble, but these interesting asymmetry that optimists can buy in? How do pessimists express themselves in a local house?
I'm laughing because I think you could sell to an iBuyer to the extent that they're willing to overpay, but that's a personal interest to me. But that's one way to express it. We've got a question here, which I think is interesting. Matt, you brought up about modular factory built housing. And so the question is, why hasn't that perhaps taken more hold across the US? And is it a function somewhat of, is there a spatial element to it where some of the transport costs drag on the cost savings you get from manufacturing in a more, in a cleaner and more controlled setting?
I love that question. What has fascinated me about modular housing is time to build, that I think these guys could get the job done in a third the time of bringing in an old-fashioned crew. So Jim, I actually don't know the answer to that question. And there's not enough real estate nerds working on modular housing. And I've meant to put a student on this. And so I love that question, but I give myself a B-.
But maybe you could grab one of our students after the session, Matt. We've got a couple that I think are interested in that domain. I got another one for you, which is when Franklin first kind of started the presentation here, he was talking about that. I think it was 10 minutes. Maybe it was 10 miles, Franklin, but there was there was some kind of circle around the location of that entry firm that saw a disproportionate impact on the low-wage renters. In other words, those low-wage renters got dispersed. They had to leave that area and they were replaced by maybe high-wage renters or homeowners, that had high wages. With what Matt's talking about as perhaps work location gets disassociated with where we do that work, with where we're physically sitting. Do you see that 10-minute or 10-mile circle changing? In other words, is that going to be a 20-mile or 30-mile or 40-mile? And what does that mean? Because when you first said it, I thought, okay, well, going back to our first two sessions from today, we're going to have to go buy, we have to protect housing within that 10-minute circle, and we're going to have to go build a bunch of stuff in that 10-minute circle. But maybe that's not the right way to think about it, given what Matt's telling us on remote work and some of those impacts. Curious on the two of you guys and your thoughts on there.
Absolutely, yeah, I love that question, and I think with the rise of work from home and kind of young, high-skilled folks' disproportional taste for consumption amenities, this kind of all the house price effects that I find for workers who initially live within 10 minutes could very much be reversed. It could be the other way. Like now, I demand more housing in the more suburban areas. They're further away from the entry locations, or I demand housing in service amenity centers. They're quite far away from where the job centers is. So these are, I think, interesting trends that I would like to study in the future using data.
Right. I got one more question, and then if we don't have anything else, we can wrap up. But my question goes back to the subsidy question that Franklin, you documented at the beginning of this, which is, a lot of these municipalities, those localities are paying a lot for these jobs to come in. It's unclear what the benefit of those is to some of the current residents. I mean, in an aggregate sense, you document that the cities grow from it, but it seems to be a little bit more nuanced of which residents within those cities, the people that are there, the people that are coming there, benefit the most from it. And yet, when you give a subsidy away, obviously it's less revenue in your pocket as you're the locality. So it's tax money that I can't use to create more housing, to Matt's point. So how, if you were going in, and Matt, feel free to chime in here too, but if you were going in and you were asked to be a consultant to a city and saying, I'm attracting all these high wage firms, I'm using these subsidies to get them to come into my community, I know I benefit for the long term, but I do have an obligation to help the people that are here today. What would you tell them to do? How would you tell them to act? Would you tell them to get rid of the subsidies? Would you say, take a portion of what you would have paid in subsidies and create housing, and that's the benefit of the workers and to the firms coming in? What's your overall kind of view on that?
First of all, I think like an overbidding for these high skill firm entries could definitely have a negative effect, right? Especially if we don't have enough tax revenues in the longer run, it could actually hurt local public goods provision. So maybe don't overdo it. And then in terms of providing affordable housing, we could also ask the tech companies who come in to help. So recently, I think Facebook and Google have pledged to build more affordable housing in the new cities they're entering. So that could be a solution, good solution as well.
I think that's very smart. Jim, I have a question for you, if we're allowed to do this.
Okay, sure.
From a local official like a mayor's point of view, I apologize for my diabolical question. Are there some mayors who actually do we know enough about how these companies choose what neighborhood they will be welcomed to? So do mayors have an urban renewal strategy? And by bringing in the big boys like Amazon, do they get what they wanted done? And then they can blame Amazon versus a new Robert Moses of saying, your infrastructure projects caused this. Am I being too Kissinger-esque here? If that's a well-posed question?
Perhaps, and I don't know, it'd be fun if we had, I have to look in the attendee box, see if we have any elected officials on with us today. But, generally speaking, I would say, those are probably few and far between, right? I mean, I think, you look at some of the literature and you look at what Richard Florida tells us about how some cities go about attracting high wage tech firms to the location, and yet they don't really have a plan to build their cities and to create the infrastructure and to create the housing that's needed. And then you get these situations like you have in the Bay Area, where you don't have housing and you don't have the infrastructure. And all of a sudden now you see those individuals start to leave those cities because you haven't planned, to your point, Matt, in advance. And also because remote work is allowing them to do things that they couldn't do before. So no, my sense of it is, I haven't done research on this like you all have, but my sense is that those cities are pretty isolated. I do have one more, there's a question here. Let me read this real quick. It says, Franklin, your conclusions show that low-skilled individuals are more inclined to leave a growing market and move to an area that's lower cost, but with less opportunity. Do large tech companies, oh, this is good, have a moral obligation to promote remote working to spread the wealth of their workforce and limit the effects of gentrification? In addition, does the government also have a moral obligation to increase the minimum wage? And would your research suggest that a combination of these effects would make a substantial dent in our affordability crisis outside of current LIHTC and subsidies?
That's a fantastic question, and on the first one, yeah, I definitely agree. The high-tech firms should have a moral obligation to promote equal opportunity among the local residents and trying to spread out the wealth of their workforce. Especially given the rise of work from home. On the question about minimum wage, I think that's not really what my area of expertise is. The moral obligation to increase minimum wage. I don't think it's if it's the case that these high skill firms are generating a lot of the kind of spillovers in terms of service jobs, and then perhaps we don't necessarily need to increase minimum wage. That it will just naturally drive up the demand for these service jobs, and they will pay higher wages over time. So not sure if minimum wage is the most relevant policy here.
Matt, I'm giving you last word as the old guy. What do you say to that?
I think this has been a great session. I think that cities like Baltimore, Cleveland, Detroit will attract these tech workers who live there, but work for at a mothership at one of the next HQ3s. And so as we call it a day, and I think that this has been a great session, I'd have everyone think about that Franklin has used millions of data points to teach us. The New York Times keeps writing these stories about a single plant. And what I love about his work is teaching us of looking at this huge sample and how this has affected millions of people. And I think this is a very important public policy issue. And if the tech companies can get ahead of this and address this affordability issue, they'll have more success being welcomed in more and more cities. But Jim, thank you for inviting me. This was very informative.
Thank you, man. Thank you, Franklin. Phenomenal time sharing the great research you've done, Franklin. Thank you, Matt, for pushing him on some of those issues. And I think it was a great tie-in to the other two panels that we had and really pulled all of it together. So thanks again for being here. I also want to thank some of the folks that were behind the scenes that made today happen. In particular, Sydney Bannerman from the Kenan Institute, my Wood Center colleague, Kitty Hambrick, and then Dominic Abenante from our IT Academic Services, who's our Zoom master, and made sure all this technology went off today flawlessly. I want to thank our Wood Center Advisory Board and the Kenan Institute Board. In particular, I want to thank Charlie Brindell from Mill Creek Residential Trust, who chairs our affordable housing initiative within the Wood Center. And then I'd like to thank each of you, everybody that spent at least part of your day with us. We hope you'll continue to engage with the Wood Center and the Kenan Institute around housing affordability issues. And clearly, we are open to your feedback and your suggestions at any time.